Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so going live now. Good afternoon. This is our August Ask iToo live stream. Joined today by Jaime.
Hi everyone, welcome back from holidays. We hope everyone had a great time and ready to take over the rest of the year. So let's kick it.
Yeah. So if you've never watched one of our live streams before, just a little bit of information about what we're doing here. So as you can imagine, we get asked a lot of questions over the course of a month. Lots of course questions on support or sent to our email addresses. Some of them are not interesting about licensing things, but some of them tend to be quite interesting and may reveal different techniques and tips and tricks that we think the rest of the community would benefit from. So this live stream is an attempt to share some of those things that maybe only one or two people would normally see if you're on the forums, or even just individuals if you answered via email. So we're just sharing some stuff from the last month, really. So without further ado, I'll move on unless we've got any news we want to share, Jaime.
Well, maybe people might be interested in the fact that we are about to release a new beta version of Forcepack 8, which is coming out in, I would say, during September. That's quite exciting. And our intention is to have a final build around the beginning of December. So Forcepack 8 beta coming out in a couple of weeks.
That's brilliant.
That's great news.
That said, though, please don't ask us what's in it until until it's out, because we can't let you know until it's actually released, the beta version.
Exactly.
So something to look forward to. So I'm going to move on very quickly to a question we got asked, quite an interesting one, which was, how can I create a raked gravel effect, something like you'd see in a Zen garden, using Forcepack? And this was an interesting question, and I actually thought I was going to make a little tutorial about this, but as it turned out, I wasn't particularly pleased with the way it looked, and the technique was less of a Forcepack solution and more of a general Mac solution, so it didn't really fit into our typical tutorial stream. But that said, I think it's an interesting enough question that we can share some kind of general tips and techniques on how you might go about doing that here. And it also does use, this particular approach that I came up with, does use one of our free plugins called Spline Offset, which you can just download for nothing from our website. So I'll show you how this works. I've got a starter scene here. Nothing particularly fancy. I've just got a kind of surface on the ground, and I've got some rocks which are scattered with Forcepack, but that's kind of by the by in this scene, really. And I've also got a spline around the perimeter, which is important, and I've also got some splines under the rocks here, so you can see this little circle one in the background. The one here is quite small, so you can't see it. So you can see there's a spline there. So there's two spline objects, one that's circling the rocks and one that's around the edge. And what we're actually going to do is not create that raking effect by scattering kind of a Forcepack object, but just do it with displacement instead. But as you know, we're very keen on procedural approaches to things, so I wanted to do that in a way that was fully procedural, so that if you changed the shape of the ground, or if you moved the rocks around or something like that, then you could always update it quite easily. So I'm going to also try and render some of these previews live, so hopefully that won't kill my stream, and apologies if it does or things slow down, in which case I will stop immediately, but we'll keep an eye on that. So first of all, my surface, nothing fancy here. I've just got a V-ray displacement modifier on here with a smallish amount, 1.25 centimeters, and currently no texture map. So what I'm going to do is open up the material editor, and I've got one already built here, mainly in case I forget what I was doing. And I'm going to kind of recreate this now for you. So let's start with a gradient ramp, and we can use that to create the kind of bumps for our raked gravel. So we'll do a gradient ramp here, and we'll just change some colors here. So I'm going to make these starts and the ends white of this gradient ramp, both white, and then the middle one black, like so. And I'll just leave the interpolation to linear. We obviously want a few ridges here, like rakes, so we don't really want the tiling to be set to 1. So instead we'll set it to something like 30 for U and V. So I've got a nice tiled kind of rake texture there now, but of course still fully procedural. So let me now grab the ground here and wire that up. Just wire that into the text map input and instance it in there. Okay, so if I was to render now, you should see some kind of raked effect. So I'm going to risk it. I'll just do a quick real-time render. Now I'm probably not going to use IPR mode here because you know, I don't want to risk crashing, and IPR mode is sort of a bit unpredictable at the best of times. So I'm just going to stop and start renders. But hopefully you can see I've got kind of raked effect going across there now. That looks okay. One thing I might do while I'm here is just to break up the straightness of that a little bit. So to do that, I'm going to come into noise. I'll turn the noise on and change the amount to 10 and the size to 10 as well. And you'll be able to see just from the texture here, I'm just getting a little bit of wobble in there now, which is going to be a little bit more convincing. So that takes care of that. Now, we also want the much more challenging raking around objects. Okay, so around the perimeter and maybe around these objects, and that's perhaps less obvious. So what we'll do there, first of all, is to change or add some geometry to the scene that we can use in our materials. So I'm going to grab this exterior spline here that goes around the beds, and I'm going to add our free modifier, which is called spline offset, to that. So what this does basically, as you can see here, is it adds an offset around the chosen spline, parametrically, a set distance. And if I make this a negative distance, it will start to come in instead of going out. So I can go for about -6-ish, something like that. I can choose how many times I want to offset that. Now, one quite nice feature of spline offset is that when splines intersect, like they have done here, it automatically heals them. Okay, so it automatically cuts them together and not overlapping, which is nice and will give us a nice kind of look down there. So let's go back to our camera view. Okay, so on its own we can't do much with that now, but what we will do is extrude it downwards so that it punches through the ground. Now I want to turn off cap start and cap end, and then just drive those down like that. So that's easy enough. And then I can just probably leave that like it is, actually. That's fine. And now, of course, we can choose the number of grooves we rake into it just by coming back to the spline offset and just changing the number of parallels. And I can change the distance between them if I want to, just by changing that too. So it's all parametric, as I say. So now how do we do something with that? Well, what we're going to do is open up our material editor again. I'm going to pick the surface, and I'm going to use a V-ray distance texture. Corona has one too. I'm using V-ray at the moment. So V-ray distance texture. And I'm just going to change a few things here. So I think I had this as black, white and white, or maybe it's the other way around. So I think it's the other way around. I'm going to check my past work. Black, white, white, black. Yeah, it was nice, right? Okay. So I'm changing basically the far color to black, so the color that's furthest from these lines to black. And then the near color's white, the inside color's going to be white, and the outside color's going to be black. Actually, I don't need to change that because it's not enabled. So I can probably leave those alone. Let's try it without doing that anyway. So what I then need to do is to come down to the V-ray distance texture objects and pick the extruded spline like that around there, and set a distance, which I think will probably be about 4 or 5. And then just to see how this looks, I'll wire this into my V-ray displacement modifier as an instance and see how that goes. So let's just do a quick render. Okay, so you can see I've got some ridges around the edge now. That seems to be working. So what I didn't mention there is that I've set that spline so that it's not visible in the renders. Okay, that's why you can't see those lines there. So just right-click Object Properties, Not Visible in Renders. And that works pretty well. Great, so now I need to combine those somehow. So we can do that by using a mix map. So we need to combine these two things together. So I'm going to right click, going to go to Maps, I'm going to go to General and Mix. And I'm going to wire this one into the first input, and this one into the second input. And then how am I going to mix it? Well, I'm going to use the V-ray distance texture to mix. And what I'm going to do is basically convert this grayscale map to a solid white if I can, using an output node. So I'm going to come in here, go to Maps, General, and output. There it is, output. Okay, so if we can come in nice and close here. Just want to be able to see it a little bit clearly. Okay, so what we really want to lose are these white lines if we can. So I'm going to enable color map, going to add a point somewhere in here, and I'm just going to bring this up like so that I get a solid white line instead, right? So I've turned those light greys into whites. So now I can use that as a mask. Okay, so you can see that masking quite nicely. And if I then wire this again into my texture map input, and we do a quick IPR render, we should get a combination of those two. There we go. So you can see I've combined the raking around the outside of the perimeter with the straight lines. Working pretty well. Let's just stop that. So if we want to add more things that we're raking around, like the rocks for example, it's basically the same procedure. What I'll do is I'll pick these splines here, which are around the various stones, and actually just to save you seeing this twice, I've already set it up, so you can see I've got the same thing. I've got a spline offset, which adds the additional lines. I've got an extrude downwards, cuts down through the ground, and just for good measure I added a bit of a noise to this one just to break up the regularity. You could have done that on the outside too. So if I bring up the material editor, come back to my V-Ray display, distance texture, and I can add that as another object. Like so. Close that down, render it again, and you should see now I've got raked lines around my stones too. And there you go, that's kind of working. You see it clears up. Now I've just done circles, but of course you could have traced more interesting and accurate shapes around those stones to give you a more kind of realistic look. Great. So that works pretty well. So you could leave it like that there if you wanted to, or you can also, if you want, just add a little bit more chaos by wiring this to a new gradient ramp. So general gradient ramp into none of those. So what I'm going to do is change the gradient type to mapped. And what basically is going to happen then in mapped mode is that it's going to use the colors coming in, the black, to choose a color along this gradient. So a black coming into this map will choose this end of the gradient ramp, and white will choose this end of the gradient ramp. In this case, it's actually not really going to change it in any way. It's going to look pretty much exactly the same. So no big deal. But by wiring it into this, I can do some other bits and pieces. So let me just wire this now into the text map input. Because what I can do now is to perhaps add a little bit of noise to it. Let me just open this up a little bit. You can see, you know, it's pretty perfectly raked. And in reality, these wouldn't be so regular. There'd be little dings, there'd be little flat bits, high bits, and so forth. So what maybe we can do is to add a bit of noise here to do that. And you can see that just breaks that up a little bit, like so. You can play with the sizes and so forth. Maybe fractal might be more interesting. And you can see that's added some interesting noise there. The other thing that you could do potentially is to change the shape of these raked sections, because at the moment they're linear, and if you wanted to make them a little bit more rounded or flat at the bottom, you can turn on the color map and you could change the profile just by changing this graph. So if you see this as a profile of this raked shape, then for example if we wanted it to sort of be a little bit more shallow at the bottom, then you can just change the profile like so. Or if you wanted it a bit more pointy at the top, we could do that by changing the profile. Now I don't necessarily want that in this case, but this is how you would do it. And that pretty much covers that. So if I render it now, it should be broken up a little bit more. This happens with IPR rendering sometimes. Let me just do a regular progressive. We'll get our texture back. There we go. Okay, so it's just added a little bit more wiggle, as you can see. It's not quite so perfect anymore. It's broken up a little bit, and you could keep working on that kind of basis. All procedural, so anything can be moved, the splines can be moved, the surface can be moved, those rocks can be moved, and all the texture and the rake texture updates, which is far more preferable to my mind than having to paint this map in Photoshop or Substance or something like that. Okay, so I will stop that one there. So I'm just going to come back to my still image and I'm going to see if there's any questions. Doesn't look like there are so far.
Nope.
Nope. Brilliant.
Yep.
Okay. So moving on, I did because I was doing this, someone asked me this question, and I did sort of show them the scene. Next question they asked was, "Thanks, that's interesting. How do you make that bridge?" So I'm going to show you quickly how that bridge was made. And it was completely unnecessary to make it with RailClone, probably, but my mind works in RailClone these days faster than it does modelling anything by hand. So I'll show you how you can make this bridge quite quickly in RailClone. Nothing technical here particularly at all, just a quick overview of RailClone for people that maybe are Forest Pack users but not so familiar with RailClone. So let me open that up. I've got a separate file for that. So bridge, here we go. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is the way that you can use multiple generators in RailClone to build styles up quite quickly and easily without worrying too much about how they all snap together perfectly. So I've got a collection of very easy to model pieces here. I've got a side, I've got a plank, I've got a railing, and I've got a post, and that's all we're going to work with. Okay, so I'll start a new RailClone object and just pop open the style editor. Try and put it somewhere that you can still see everything. Something like that maybe. And then we'll start with a linear generator. In fact, all of these will be linear generators. So we'll bring in a spline, pick a spline from the scene, can be any spline. And I'm going to create the planks, like I say. So segment, and then I'm just going to pick these planks and wire them to the default input. I don't want to slice the ends like this, so I will change the mode to adaptive, and just to be doubly sure, turn off slice. Right, and now those are a little bit too perfect. Those planks are seldom manufactured that accurately. So I'm going to randomize a few things. So I'm going to maybe randomize the translation a little bit. So 0.5 to 0.5 in that direction, and maybe the scale on the Z-axis, maybe 110, make some trip hazards. Yeah, and that's probably okay. And if I turn off transform effect size, I can also scale it on the X-axis, say 90 degrees, to open up a few little gaps between them without affecting the actual layout. Okay, so now I've got a little irregular plank going across there. We can add the other bits. So I'm going to add this kind of, whatever you call it, joist that runs underneath these.
The screen.
Yeah. Ah, mate. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Classic. Thank you, Jaime.
Welcome.
Start that again. I'll edit it out. In the recording, no one will know it happened. Right. So, we add a RailClone object. Pop open the style editor. And add a linear generator. Add a spline node, wire it in, and pick any spline from the scene. Just using a straight spline for now. Add a segment. And pick the plank. Wire it to the default input. And you can see at the end it's slicing, which we wouldn't ever want. So what I'll do is to change the rules for the generator to adaptive, and that will just slightly scale all of the segments to make sure that they fit perfectly inside the spline. They're far too neat and tidy. So what I'll come and do is come into the transform tab for the segment and change the translation randomization settings, maybe minus 0.5 centimeters to 0.5 centimeters. Turn on scale. I'll scale it on the Z-axis just to make it a little bit less regular. Maybe some of that wood swollen. There we go. And also to open up some gaps between the planks, turn off transform effect size. Now that means when I change any sizes here, it won't affect the layout of adjacent segments. And then I can always make the X size a little bit smaller and randomly create some gaps between the planks. Okay, so that's very nice and quick. So now what we want to do is to add the other pieces. So I'm going to add another linear generator I'm going to add the same spline, and I'm going to add another segment and pick the side, the joist sort of that goes underneath these planks from the scene, and wire it to the default input. Now you can see it's sat on top of that, those planks. What we want to do is to put it underneath. So rather than kind of scale it or move it or whatever, I can just click on box, go to alignment Z, and change it to top, and it'll just pop it underneath. So it's aligning it to the top of the segment, to the bottom of the spline, basically. Also, to stop it being sliced on the ends, it doesn't really matter in this case actually, but I'll change it to adaptive. Okay. Now obviously I want one of those on each side, so I don't need to create another generator or do anything like that. Instead what I can do is choose the generator's properties, and in Y offset, just offset it a little bit to one side, wherever I want it to go. And then click on mirror, and it'll mirror it to the other side, like so. And that takes care of that. Now to add the rest of it, we'll add another generator. So I'm going to copy this one because I want to keep the same offset setting. So I'm just going to copy and paste it. And then I'll add another segment. Pick the post from the scene, wire it to the start and the end inputs. So this needs to come down a little bit. And this time I will do it by just changing the transform settings, just to illustrate how you do that. So the segment, come to transform, and in the Z translation option, you could do something like -7. My sizes are a little bit weird here. It isn't to scale particularly. We go -6.5 seems to work. So that goes in there, and I could also add them at regularly spaced intervals using the evenly input. So you can see I've just popped that in there too. And yeah, that takes care of that really. So the last thing that remains for us to do is to add the actual railings. So another segment. Just pick that from the scene, wire it to the default input, and there's our railings. Now these are sitting on the bottom here on the bounding box, but I'm pretty sure I've set up a pivot that's a little bit below those, so I can change the alignment for the Z axis, sorry, to use that pivot just by clicking on there, and that pretty much works and takes that up into the right position. I could just move it on the Z axis like we just saw. So great, that's all working, and that's our bridge pretty much done. We could parameterize this a little bit if we wanted to be able to change the spacing between the railings quite easily by just right clicking on it, clicking export parameters, going to evenly, this is why to the evenly input, and changing the evenly distance. So exporting that, wiring it to a numeric input. Numeric inputs always add a new value in the parameters rollout down here, so that makes it easy to edit without opening the graph. I'll give it a name so I can recognize it, and you'll see again it updates here. Change what type of number it is, scene units, and wire it to the evenly distance. So it's really huge at the moment. Let's change it to something else. You can see I've just closed the style editor, so you can see I can update this now just by changing it down there. No problem at all. So that's great. So with that done, I now have a very flexible style that I can change the size of this bridge just by changing the length of the spline. It's just turning to boxes to keep viewport display fast, it wouldn't render that way. You could also bend this bridge if you wanted to, so I could add a extra vertex here, change it to smooth, and I could bend it this way. So I create a curved bridge. But if I wanted to bend it upwards, you'll see something will happen. Well, that's fine, but it would be rather unusual for those handrails to be splaying out like that. So how would you fix that? You'd fix that with by changing the deformation modes of those segments. So at the moment they're adaptive, which means they come out perpendicular like this. But what we can do is go into the deform tab for these segments and set them all to vertical. Like so. So now they're all vertical, and the only thing that's a little bit odd now is that the tops of these are a little bit strange looking. So we could fix that by changing flat top. So this mixes a kind of stepped mode and a vertical mode, and it's measured down from the top. I can't remember the measurements exactly. There we go. If I just add a value there, flat top, it basically measures down from the top and says, hey, I want the bottom part to be vertical and I want the top part to stay stepped and underformed. And that's what I've done by adding that there. So that creates a pretty nice, easy, very fast bridge. It's very quick to model and it's very easy to update. And the nice thing is, of course, that you can always go back and edit the actual geometry and the whole bridge will update too. So if I want to change the molding on the top of the bridge, you know, I could do that. If I want to change the handrail, more handrails, all of that, I've just got to change this source geometry and everything here updates without any further action on my behalf. So, so that's pretty cool. I hope that helps if you're newish to RailClone and shows you how powerful it can be without too much effort. Do we have any questions?
Nope. There's a few complaints about background noise. I don't get it myself.
I can't kind of help that, I'm afraid. That's my computer fan running in the background. I need to sort of build a soundproof booth around it or something. I'm guessing that might be what you can hear.
We'll get a new one, Paul.
Yeah, sorry about that, but I'll need to think about that. I need to put it in a different room or something, run really long cables. Rightio. This is a question we had actually a while ago, but we've done ceiling tutorials before, and although I would probably change the way I do them now since RailClone has evolved quite a lot from that tutorial, one question we often get is, like, you've created a ceiling inside a closed spline, but kind of the lights aren't lining up the way you want, or it's not quite hitting the edges the way you want. Can you slide the ceiling from side to side and backwards and forwards inside the spline? And if so, how might I go about doing that? Well, let me show you. So I'll just switch back to desktop and not forget this time. Open up a new scene. This is a quick one, you'll be glad to know. So here I've got a basic kind of ceiling. You can see from this that it's not centered. You might want to slide that around a little bit to center these lights here, and you might even want to slide it on the other axis too. How would you do that? I'll show you. So first of all, you'd open a style editor. Let's just make this smaller. This one's super easy. Style itself's nothing fancy, as you can see. I've just got a light tile and a tile. I'm just running it through two sequences to create the pattern. So nothing fancy there. So in the 2D generator here, I've got extend XY size to area on, and that is automatically filling a closed spline with this particular array. And what you have got, if you go up a little bit here, are X offset and Y offset modes. Now people generally have spotted these and they'll try and use these to slide the ceiling around. But as you can see, what happens is that gaps get created like this. So I can slide it that way and that way, but you know, it's not ideal because now we've got a gap where we can see into the ceiling void. So what you can do is use this setting down here called expand, which fewer people are aware of, and what it does is it calculates the size of the array based on what it needs to fill it from edge to edge. But what expand will do is to create an additional size to that array based on the percentage of the X and Y axis. So if I was to extend this by 20%, I've made that array 20% larger than it needs to be to fill that spline. And what that means now is that I've got a little bit of wriggle space if I use the X and Y offset, as you can see here, to maneuver this around. So you can see I can sort of center that now a little bit more by using that X offset like I've just done, and same on the Y axis. I can do kind of the same thing because I've got space outside of the array that I can use to center that. So that's quite handy. There is one little thing I would caution here, which I'm aware that is a kind of a slight inconsistency in RailClone, but something to be aware of if you're using this is that if you use this Z rotation property to rotate the array, say by 90 degrees, then the X and Y offsets actually do the same thing. So that's a very slight kind of limitation of this at the moment, but I'm almost certain that'll be fixed in the next update, so you don't really need to worry about it for much longer. Until then, if you do need to rotate the array so that it's in a different direction and use the X and Y, you can literally just rotate the whole RailClone object and then just reselect the rectangle, and then you can do it that way. instead. Oh, I've rotated at a very random angle, but you can see that you can just rotate it that way instead of doing it numerically in here, and that will still allow you to use the X and Y offset parameters to move it around. Okay, so that's just a quick one. Any questions? Noise in the background? No, just still talking about noise. Okay. This is a question we get asked a lot. Basically, how to add a little bit more variety to grass to make it look a bit more realistic. You know, rather than just a sea of pure green. How can we break up that that kind of uniform color to make grass look a little bit how it looks in real life, especially at the moment with sort of droughts everywhere. Grass is not uniformly green everywhere.
Sorry, Paul. Before you finish, and before you change, there's a question about the last case you gave.
Yeah. So the question is, would this also work with roof tiles, for instance, if you're using a separate array to deal with the bottom course and needed to nudge the alignment? Yes, it would work with roof tiles too. The limitation there might be that if you're using the filler tiles on the side that wrap around, I've forgotten the name, verges. If you're using verges, then when you expand the array, your verges will get lost because they'll get cut off. So if you're using verges, then that's going to be a problem. But if you're not using verges, then you can do the same thing. Sometimes the only way to do it is to forget expanding to the clipping spline automatically, create the array a bit bigger than the spline manually, either using an X and a Y spline or just using XY dimensions, and then use a separate spline just to clip it afterwards. That way you can just move it into position just using, you know, the transforms or whatever. You can just put it where you want it and then cut it afterwards, rather than let it sort of create the spline perfectly for you. And that gives you the most control, but it's less friendly to set up, I guess, and less easy to kind of just click on loads of stuff and fill up areas. But if you've got a really tricky roof, that's probably the only way you're going to be able to do it. Good question. Right, so let me load up this grass one. I'm not going to render this one because it'll make my computer even louder, but I have got some images saved. Switching back to desktop, just loading this file up. So I've got a standard grass in this scene when it eventually arrives. Just a preset, and it's got very simple materials on it. And this is mainly about texturing materials, this one. So let me just pop open this. This is this preset as it looks by default. Not very realistic and not very exciting. I might have made it a bit less exciting than it is in real life, but very uniform green, as you can see. Not really how we want it to look. So let me just open up Material Editor and take a look at what we've got here. So like I say, it's a simplish material. I've got a forest color map here, and I have got down here just an aerial photograph of some grass or a field that I can use. And as you can see, I mean, it's sort of tiled badly, but as you can see, we can kind of use this to add a bit of variety. So the easiest way to do it is to use the forest color map, which is already here. Just double click on that, and down at the bottom here you've got this tint override setting, and I think most people are aware of this, but just in case you're not, I can basically turn this on, and I've got the option to tint these colors, these maps that are wired into the forest color map, using another map like this, and applying it using one of several blending modes. So by default it's set to color, and that's fine. So what I would do is wire this to this get color from map input, and I'd set it to as texture on surface. So that will use the UV maps of the texture of the surface to which this grass is applied, and every time a patch is selected, it looks down at the single pixel that's underneath it, it reads that color, and then it applies it to the whole patch using this blending mode. Okay, now that'll do pretty well, actually, surprisingly. Now in this mode, the item element slider doesn't really do anything, it's always item. Just a limitation of this technique. So what you'll end up with that is something like, if I go into 8B, something like this. So this is our original, and this is how it looks after doing that. And you can see that I've basically tinted all of those patches using that particular map. Okay, and it looks okay, but there is a limitation because as I mentioned, it only tints whole patches. And if you look at this, actually I'm quite a way out, but these patches are about the size of these pyramids here, which means there's going to be quite a little patch of grass that's going to get given a single colour. Yeah. So another option might be to try this. So I will detach that from the forest colour map and in fact turn off tint override. Now you could, if you're feeling really lazy, just wire this in. I'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, let's kind of recreate what this is doing, but with a composite map. So I'll right click, go to maps, go to general, and add a composite map. And I'm going to wire forest colour to the first input and wire this to the default input. I want to add one more layer, and this will be for my texture here, and I'll wire that into there. Now I've got the same options here. I can choose from actually more transfer modes this time. I'm going to choose color to keep it the same though. So I've got transfer modes there that I can choose from, and I've got the map. But of course now this map will be applied to each blade of the grass, right? It's not going to be applied to the surface underneath in the same way, and that's obviously a problem. That's not going to work. But one way of getting around that is just to change the way that this particular texture is mapped directly from in the material by coming up here to where it says mapping, and instead of using explicit map channel I can use planar from world X, Y, Z or Z. Just by clicking that, it's kind of projecting it down in the world. I don't need UV coordinates, and it won't map it individually to each patch anymore. What I will need to do is to set the size, so I'll change the mode to real world size, and I'm going to make this 25 meters by 25 meters, and I think just for the sake of how I've got the renders I offset it by 12.5 there too. But basically that now will project that down, and you'll get a similar effect as if I'd wired it into color tint map, but instead of each patch taking just a single pixel color, it will now basically have the map projected down on top of it and mix it that way. And the difference is quite subtle, but it is really helpful when you look at it side by side. So quite pronounced. So let's switch this to A, and get in a bit closer. So you can see, for example, maybe streaming isn't going to do this justice, but you can see in this area here, for example, there is some discoloration here, but it's quite diffuse. Whereas if I swipe over to the new version, you can see I'm getting a lot more detail in that discoloration of the grass there. Yeah, but I can still see the individual blades of grass. And the same over here. You know, I can kind of see how that's all working there. So this is giving you a much more realistic effect. Lots of discoloration, which is really nice, and I've started doing it this way for myself because I find that I can pick up all these nice little details, and it makes a real difference. Now, you could just ignore all of that completely and just think, well, actually, why not just use the texture? I'll just wire it straight to the diffuse input, and just pick the colors up that way, and you can absolutely do that. This one is a bit too dark, I would say. For that, but you could color correct it, and then you would still get something pretty passable. So you could bypass all that other stuff, adding loads of blades of grass textures, and just project it down onto some grass. That kind of looks okay too. So that's not too bad. But like I say, you'd probably want to color correct that. It's a bit too dark, and that's just the fault of my map. Or you could mix it with that. So I could come back to my composite, and then maybe instead of mixing it by color, which of course doesn't change the value at all, only changes the saturation and the hue, we could change it back to normal and then maybe lower the percentage to 65% or something like that, and blend it that way instead. And if you were to do that, you'd end up with something like this one here, which is a nice kind of compromise. It could probably be blended even more, but that's looking somewhat like the original, but now with some nice natural discoloration on there. So there's loads of things you can do here, loads of different options, some things to play with that will give you lots of different results, and all of these are just from one map basically applied to the existing preset. But all of them look better than without this effect. You definitely need some especially at the moment, you definitely need some natural kind of variation added to your grasses. Are there any questions?
Nope.
No questions today.
It's
quiet.
after summer. Relax.
Well, maybe I'm just making perfect sense, which would be very rare.
Again, for the people that joined the seminar later, news at the beginning is that we are releasing ForcePack 8 beta in a couple of weeks, and the intention is to have a definite build before the end of the year. That should be the first week of December, maybe.
Brilliant, thanks.
You have to want to remind.
Yeah, it's worth reminding people. Can this be applied to rugs? Yeah, absolutely. That can be applied to rugs. There's no limit. I mean, it's just a max trick. Actually, we did originally. That was a really handy way of getting this kind of surface variation using renderers that didn't support using forest packs as texture on surface feature. So I'm not sure if it does work now, but V-Ray GPU never used to support as texture on surface. So this was kind of a way of working around that. And actually, I realised that I kind of preferred the way it looked. So since then, I use whatever it needs. But I've found it's a pretty viable technique. Thanks, Lars. Okay, so we had a few questions about using Forest Pack to fill a volume, which isn't really what Forest Pack was designed for, but is nonetheless something that might be of interest. And so in this particular image here, I've just filled a volume with balloons using Forest Pack. And I say I'm using Forest Pack, it's a little bit Forest Pack in cooperation with another plugin, which you will have for free. So let me just show you how this works. So I've got a basic setup here, got some balloons, I've got a volume, and that's it actually. So what I'm going to do actually is use Forest Pack's ability to work alongside or use particles as a scatter source. So I think this came in Forest Pack 6. But again, I'm not 100% sure how many people know it's there or how many people are using it. But it is a nice efficient way of using particles to scatter things with Forest Pack. And of course, once Forest Pack got the ability to scatter non-geometric objects, it meant that you could use particles very easily to scatter things like lights or, you know, anything else you want, really. So it's quite a handy trick and worth going over quickly. I'm going to use... It is compatible with TyFlow, I should point out. But because not everyone has TyFlow installed, in this particular case, I'm going to use particle flow. But I mean, it's pretty much the same. So you create your pflow source and open your particle view. And let's just delete these old ones that are here. So this is your kind of standard setup for you'll get with our new pflow. And we don't need most of this. So we don't need the speed because I just want to fill a volume with static objects. So we don't need that. We don't want to rotate them randomly. I can do that in Forest Pack if I want to. I don't need it to output a shape because I don't want it to render actual geometry. And that's really all I need. What I do need to do is change the position that I'm scattering on, because at the moment it's position icon, which you'll see it's appearing here. So what I want to do is find position object instead. So I'll come into position object and just drag it over the top and it will overwrite it. Come over here. I'll add my volume here as an emitter object. So just like that. And then where it says location, I'll change it to volume. So now I'm doing is basically using pflow to scatter inside that volume. I don't want it to animate in this particular case, so I'll set the emit, start and stop to 0, which gives me 200 particles from the outset. Right? I can, of course, increase it. Let's go up to 400 for fun. Close enough. Right, so now I've got that. I want to take these 3 balloons and I'm going to come up to my icon up here for once on the toolbar to create a new forest object. Just remind you that there's this option here that says populate from selection. So if I've got objects already selected, I can just turn that on, and when I create a new forest object, it will automatically add those to the geometry list. So I'll just do that, new forest pack object. Right click, come over to the modify panel, and you should see in the geometry list those balloons are added. There they are. Now what I need to do is to find this particle flow mode. So it's in the distribution rollout. And if you come to the top, you've got several modes here that in addition to the image mode that I think we're all very familiar with. So we come down to particle flow, and from here I can just pick a particle flow. from the scene. And you can see it's added those balloons to the particle flow. Pinpoint cloud mode, so you can see what they are. So it's really as easy as that. And you can see that the transform, rotation settings and everything is still working, scale's still working. Even if you want it, you can still translate randomly. And of course, all the other forest pack features are still working. So if you're using forest color to randomize and that kind of thing, then you can still do all that too. And you've got all the kind of memory saving advantages of using forest pack, multi-threaded and so forth. Also, this is almost interactive. If I come into particle view and I want to change the number of balloons I've got here, for example, I could change this up to 800. There's just one little catch. Before I see it in the viewports, you can see the particles have updated, just nudge the timeline, just nudge the playhead and it updates forest pack. Okay, so if I take it down to 400 and just move that, it updates. Obviously you could animate it if you wanted to as well. So I hope that answers the questions we've had about scattering inside volumes. I actually think it's quite powerful because you can scatter inside any shape. You're not limited to bounding boxes or anything else. And the P-flow setup is not at all complicated. It's probably just as easy to quickly do that as it would be for us to add this feature to Forest Pack. I think this is actually a simpler approach. So yeah, any questions about that, please let me know. Yes, there's a question there. If they're using particle flow, does this mean it's also compatible with TyFlow? It does. I seem to remember that TyFlow has an option in it to enable the particle. I can't remember the phrasing of it here actually. I think I've got it. Yeah, I've got it here. Hang on a second. So I think there's an option you need to turn on in TyFlow to be compatible with Forest Pack, and it's somewhere around here. Interfaces, yeah, you need to enable particle interface, right? I don't know if that's changed, but you certainly always used to have to enable particle interface, and then it was visible to Forest Pack, and you could use it with Forest Pack in exactly the same way as you can with P-Flow. Does distribution amount work in Forest Pack, or we have to change the amount in P-Flow? So yes, in this case, because it's scattering one object per particle. So if you want more objects, you need more particles. So you would have to change that in P-Flow, not in Forest Pack. I hope that makes sense. Can we put that into the... Mike's asking, can you put that into the new build? I'm not sure what that is that's being referred to there. So maybe, Mike, if you could let me know. Or maybe I've missed a question there somewhere else. But if you could let me know what you mean now, I'll answer that in a second. Right. So where was I? Scattering volume. Oh yeah, this was an interesting one. A bit of a specialist one. This is a technique that I think people who have been around Macs know about and have been familiar with for a while. But using the kind of Morpher modifier to create parametric facades. But you can, to keep things really parametric, you can do this in combination with RailClone. So I've had actually a few questions on the forum the last month with people using this technique to kind of combine two RailClone objects via a Morpher modifier to create these kinds of parametric facades. And it's a really interesting approach that maybe because the tutorials that were around for it are so old now, maybe people have, relatively new to Macs, maybe they're not aware of it, and you will put up with me explaining it one more time, but with a little bit of RailClone magic added to the mix. So I'm going to switch back to desktop. I'm going to come into open this file. So let me show you what I've got. I've tried to make this as completely procedural as possible. So I've got the standard RailClone object as it was sent to me by the user, and then a couple of modifications I've made. So here is the standard RailClone object. It's nothing particularly complicated. It's just a grid, 2D array, and a grid of open windows there. So what we need, what we're going to do is morph between these open windows into closed windows. And what we need for that is a segment that has the windows closed, like that, but, and this is important, has exactly the same number of vertices. So basically, if we're using the Morpher modifier, the vertex count of the target and the original, sorry, and then the target version, the morph version, has to be identical. Otherwise, it just won't work. So I did that. This was the original, which is a different size, so that wouldn't work. So I did that just by cloning this one out and just grabbing the vertices in the middle here just simply scaling them on the x-axis just to flatten them down, which seems a bit painful, but you won't see it in the render. There's nothing there anymore. So that's how that was created there. But you can imagine now the vertex count is still the same. Just don't weld anything or do anything to change the vertex count of that particular segment. Okay, so with that done, what I want to do, and there's two ways of doing this with morphers. You could capture the state of the current thing, so I could add a little switch and capture the state of it, but I'm going to do it by creating a clone of the RailClone object. So I find it's a bit easier to update that way, but anyway is perfectly fine. So I'll right click on this. I'm going to select the RailClone base objects because I want to copy those over as well, and then I'm going to select the RailClone object and I'm going to move the whole thing over to the side as an instance to start with. Okay, so basically I'm doing that because I want the two splines to be instant. So if I change the height of this building or the floor plate or something like that, then this other RailClone object will update too. Now what I don't want to be instant is the RailClone object itself, because obviously I need to change that. So I'll make that unique, and probably that'll lose contact with its splines, which it has. So what I'll do now is just reapply those splines. So I'll pick the rectangle as the X spline, and I could leave the Y spline as it is actually, but I'll pick that one too. The important thing I'm also doing here, the reason I'm copying all that over like that, is that I need the pivot point to remain the same in relation to the geometry. If I just kind of copied the splines over and reassigned them, I'd end up with the pivot point over here and the geometry over here, and then that's going to be problems when I morph. So anyway, so this gives me my RailClone object all fine, and now I can modify it. So I can come back to my graph for this one. I've already imported this other segment that I just showed you, so I can just swap it over. So now I've got one that's closed, and you see I've got the little windows in the middle flattened. And now I can morph between those. So a couple of other important things. Let's just check these numbers. So with it closed, I've got 130,518 vertices. Let's click on this one. 130,520. So there's an issue there because the vertex count is different, and that'll just be because just that slight change is causing the slicing somewhere to be slightly different. So what I'm going to do is to come into these segments, and just to really try and drive it home, I'm going to try and disable slicing for these segments. So remember, I've got 1,520, and this one, I think this one had slice on still, and that's the issue. Yeah, so now I've got 130,520 on both. That's good. That's what I need. Right, so that's all good. That'll work. Right, so now I can add a Morpher modifier to this. Now, in order to do this, you can't instance while you're doing this, so I'm going to have to turn the instancing engine off, which I've already done. And just to be doubly safe, I'm going to add a turn to mesh modifier on top, just to make sure that that is reading as a mesh and not something else. You also, of course, want to in the RailClone object, make sure that the mesh is displaying and you're not in some box display mode or something like that. So you'd also want to make sure that viewport mesh is on. And now that's pretty much done. So now we're into standard Mac stuff for a little bit. So I'd come into here and add a Morpher modifier. Let me just unfurl that a little bit. Oops. Come on, behave yourself. There we go. Just want to open that up. Right. And then in the Morpher modifier, you can see I've got my morph states down here, and I've got the amount I'm morphing between them here. I want to pick, to create a morph target, I want to click pick object from the scene and pick it from here. Now it's not letting me, and that is because I did not put a turn to mesh modifier on there. There you go. That's what I need to do. Let's try that again. Pick object from scene. Now it's picked it. Okay. So now in theory, when I turn this number up, you should see these windows close. There you go. So that's working. That's great. But of course, we're closing all the windows, and we want to selectively close the windows based on some kind of selection. And that's why I've got this weird sort of capsule-y shape here. And again, in the spirit of trying to keep everything completely procedural, this is all driven by a spline, which is in here somewhere, using a loft object. So you'll see if I move the base spline, I can move that around easily enough. And if I pick the actual kind of capsule, or whatever you want to call that shape, then this is a loft object, which means I can also change the kind of shape of this using these graphs, which is pretty cool. So, you know, I can change these graphs to change the shape of this piece of geometry that I'm going to be using to select vertices. Of course, this is also set up to object property in object properties, or it should be so that it's not renderable. Okay, so we don't want that to render because that's just purely a selection tool. Right, and now we're ready. So what I want to do is to go below the Morpher modifier, and then I'm going to add a volume select to that, and I'm going to change the selection level to vertex, and I'm going to change the select by to mesh object, and I'm going to pick that loft object. And what you should see is that I'm selecting all the vertices inside that capsule. Now, because we're going to get some pretty abrupt changes, if I don't, I'm going to turn on soft selection and increase the value a little bit, so we'll fade out. And I'm passing that selection up the stack. If I come up to the Morpher modifier again and turn this up to 100%, you should see that the windows are now just closed inside the selection. So that's working pretty well. Of course, like I mentioned, it's procedural, so I can move that shape around, I can change it, I can move the spline, I can even go back and change the RailClone object, as we'll do in a minute. But there's some issues, which you can see if I look at this window here. Because of the fall off, obviously the bottom vertices are being selected more than the top ones, so I'm getting a window which is a slightly odd shape, and that might be what you want. But chances are you want that window to be a standard size, excuse me. There is a way of fixing that. But I caution you that this is a little bit slow. So while you're making any modifications to the RailClone object or the selection shape or anything like that, I would turn this modifier off because it slows things down quite a bit. But what we're going to do is to use data channel. Relatively new. And what this lets us do is to process the selection that's coming up through the stack in various ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the vertex input and add that. So I'm going to bring the vertices in, and I'm going to bring in not the position of the vertices, but the selection. Okay, you can see I'm getting some nice colors to indicate the selection there. And then I want to use a operator called geoquantize, and what this is basically going to do is average out the vertex selection of all the vertices within each mesh element. Right, so if I add this here, and you can see it's happening already, I don't really need to change anything, but you have got options, but you can see it's geoquantizing by mesh element. So you now see that each square has the same color, each element of the facade has the same color, which means it's going to get the same value in the Morpher modifier. And now I need to output that new selection, so I'll just come down here to vertex output, add that. And then we definitely don't want to output position. You can see that's doing some cool stuff, but not what we want. I just want to output vertex selection. And now you should see that the windows are back to being rectangular. Okay, so that fixes that little problem. Now actually what the user wanted was to not to completely close the windows in this area, but there was some kind of random windows that were still open to create a bit more interest. So I had to go back and think about how to do that, which is pretty easy, fortunately, because we have the morph target set up as a RailClone object. So I'm just going to turn this data channel off again just for speed, and then come back to here and open up the style editor. And you can see I've already got my windows in here, so that's fine. So I can basically, I'm going to create a pattern. So I'll create a sequence and wire the windows to the second input. You can see that's creating a nice pattern across there. But I want to randomly shut some of them. So let's add a random number, randomize operator to that, and wire the closed window to the second input. So now I've got a bit more randomization there, which is cool. Maybe I don't want quite that many open windows, so I'll reduce the presence to 50%. So now I've got a few less. That's working. And now what I can do is come back to here, and in theory, provided the vertex count hasn't changed, and I haven't checked it, I can reload morph target. Yeah, and that worked. So now you can see I've got some random open windows in that closed window area, which is working great. I can put my data channel back on again now. So yeah, it's an interesting technique. Say it's not a new technique, but but I think it works quite nicely with RailClone and quite nicely with making everything parametric. One of the nice things about Max's modifier stack, isn't it, is that you can do a lot parametrically with it. And I hope you know it's fun to play with, if nothing else. So I hope that might be helpful. Let's move back to. I can bring up chat like this actually.
We have a couple of questions, Paul.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, he wants the map image that I used probably isn't copyright free, so I probably can't share that, but I'm sure we can find something equivalent. They're easy to find online anyway. One rail. Did you want to read them? Sorry, Jaime.
Yeah, we have a question from Lars. It says, RailClone question. Well, he said might be a request. It can be really complicated to manage the direction of the inbuilt UVW handler in the segment. And as this is more or less the only way to make scale objects act correct, or do you have some workarounds?
I think that's because we have added some things recently, but I'm 100% sure Lars is familiar with those. But let me just show you just in case. So in case you weren't aware, this is a question about manipulating UVs on segments. And of course you can rotate the maps, but that was always quite difficult, and when you get into windows and things, getting the corners working and stuff is quite difficult to make like a wooden grain go up to the corner and then return around the edge, and that probably deserves a tutorial actually. But we did try to make that a little bit easier by adding additional rotation properties down here for when you're using box mapping. So you have got the ability to rotate separately on the X, Y, and Z axis now. So that can help in those cases. And I did manage to get corners working with that. It's still not an easy process, but sometimes that's the nature of working, you know, parametrically. I think that is probably one, Lars, that we'll need to talk about, you know, over email or something like that, because I'm imagining you've got a particular use case, or it'll be helpful for me to know exactly what you're trying to achieve there, and see if this is helpful, or if it's something we really need to improve within how RailClone already works and what's possible, of course. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, and the last question, since we ran out of time, can we use a noise map for that instead of something like Loft? That's regarding
100% you can. Yeah. So so this, just turn a few things off while we do this. So yeah, you've got the ability to use texture maps there. So you can see here's a texture map, and you add your map there, and then it will use the grayscale value of that map to select instead of geometry. So if I added a noise map, since that's what we're talking about, gosh, I haven't tested this, I hope it's going to work now. So if I add that down there, right, okay, so you can sort of see that's working. I'll just punch up the contrast a little bit and try and change the size. So yeah, you can see that's starting to go. So you can see my selection is now being made by a map. All I did was change it to texture map down there and select the map. And then, you know, and then the rest of it's the same. So we can put the data channel on there and the morpher. And just let me deselect it so we can actually see it. So now you can see that's kind of working there too. Right, and that was using a texture map. So I can easily kind of update that map and get different buildings. So you can see it's working all the way around as well. So yeah, absolutely. In answer to your question, yes, it's very easy to use a noise map with this technique. Great. So are there any other questions, Jaime?
No, it's a support case and nothing else. So time is over.
Wow, went fast.
Yep.
As always, thanks. Really, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming and for the interesting questions. It's always really enjoyable to get these questions, and it's nice to be able to share, because sometimes these answers, you know, on the forum or whether it's on email, they take a while to work out on our side. So it's nice to be able to share them with other people in the hope that, you know, they're useful for more than just the original intended recipient. And it's also a good reason to send us interesting questions. So if you have got something interesting you're trying to do, then, you know, knowing that we might be able to help other people, it's probably worth sending it in. So thank you for that. And some of these I might also turn into tutorials as well, if they take even longer to set up. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Jaime, before we sign off.
Nothing. Just thanks everyone for showing up, and we'll be online again in a month. So thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Yep.
See you
Goodbye.
in September.
Adios.